Okay, today we're really pleased to have Ken Wisian as our speaker. Ken has a good Texas background. He was an undergraduate here at UT Austin and got his bachelor's degree in physics. And during the time he was actually working for his bachelor's degree, he was a summer intern at McDonnell Observatory. So Ken and I probably ran across each other in the what we call the transient quarters at that time, where the astronomers and the interns stayed. But I don't think either one of us really remembers it. And to finish out his educational background, he earned a PhD in geophysics at SMU. Ken has spent his career in the Air Force, doing, among other things, flying B-52s and the MQ-1 Predator. And he rose to the rank of Major General and was commander of the Texas Air National Guard. And he then retired from the Air Force, I believe, in 2015. And then he served as a senior deputy director of the Coastal Protection and Disaster Recovery at the Texas General Land Office. Came to UT in 2018, where he was executive director of the Disaster Research Program, and he is now the associate director of the Environmental Division of the Bureau of Economic Geology. And so we're really pleased to have Ken give our seminar today. Go ahead, Ken.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the my fantastic summer at the observatory. That was such an experience. I myself and the other intern there were given one of the little stone houses on top of the hill, so I didn't actually stay in the transient quarters. But it was a great time. You do tours during the day and scam any untaken telescope time at night, which that summer involved a fair amount of time on the 30 and 36-inch scopes. So yeah, a lot of fun. And working with Paul Harvey also my senior year as an undergrad too. All right, let me share my screen. And it should be this one. So you should see my title slide. So I've got what probably, at least I think, is a little bit of an offbeat topic to talk about today. It deals with SETI and deals more with the international political side of SETI. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Here's a nice shot I took of Owens Valley a couple of years ago. By the way, I do like interaction, so please just chime in with questions at any point. And let me also see if I can keep my chat box open so I can see if anyone asks questions. All right. So with that, let me dive right on into the overlooked risk of SETI success. If it will advance. There we go. Okay, I realize that a lot of this will be common knowledge to you. I apologize if I undershoot people's knowledge level. But SETI, although there's talk of it going back even thousands of years in some ways or another, really got started in 1960 with Frank Drake and Project Ozma. It has continued in fits and starts to the present day, including, I guess you'd call it a golden age of NASA support, now largely relying on private funding at this point. SETI traditionally, of course, has been based on the idea of radio signals, of detecting, transmissions that we could hopefully decipher in one form or another from ETIs, somewhere else out in the universe or out in the galaxy. That has expanded more recently into other areas of the electromagnetic spectrum, most notably optical / laser-based systems, but also quite interesting, I think, and taking off now, which some of y'all are working on, the non-radio techno-signature type of searches, which have fascinating potential, I think. In general discussions of SETI, the consensus has been that impact, if we actually end up discovering intelligent signals, and of course there have been false alarms multiple times in history, but if we actually end up finding anything, the general consensus is that the impact would be obviously huge on humanity in the long run, but negligible to most people on a day-to-day basis. I mean, if you're just struggling to make ends meet day to day, the fact that aliens have actually been discovered or detected is not going to really impact your life. And it's a fascinating juxtaposition, I think, because for most of us, it would be just perhaps one of the most significant events in our lifetime and would have immediate impact on our thinking and work and research. And also, there's been a general thought that the main people that might really get worked up about this would be some religious extremists who would object to that change in their worldview or universe view or cosmology, however you want to look at it, but that would be a relatively minor issue. In general, existential risk associated with SETI has been assumed to be negligible because, thanks to the physics involved, it's really pretty unlikely that aliens are going to show up on our doorstep to eat us. So the idea generally is that, yeah, just discovering signals, fascinating, no real threat. What has been a much more contentious topic, and again, I'm guessing some of y'all have chimed in on this debate at various times, is the debate over METI, or messaging extraterrestrials, or another term is active SETI. The idea here being, let's beam messages outward, and that goes way back to near the to the 60s also, as far as early attempts at that. It's a rather niche but hot debate that flares up periodically in the academic world. And it's one I have a very definite opinion on, which I'll probably figure out in a little bit. The legality is really an open issue. You know, the crux of the matter is who has the right or the authority or who can prevent someone from doing what they want and broadcasting a message out to the universe. The legality of it, as I said, is weak, and I'll come to that a little bit more in a minute. But international law is virtually mute on the topic. You can kind of do some pretzel twisting on the law to kind of see how you might apply it to the issue, but there's definitely no consensus on the issue. Perhaps more relevant to most of us on the scientific and engineering side is the barn door question. And even here, there's strong arguments on both sides of the issue. The idea being that, you know, it doesn't really matter whether we deliberately broadcast signals out or not, because for 100+ years, we have been leaking all our radio, microwave, and et cetera transmissions out into space. And so we've got this expanding bubble around the Earth where anyone with a big enough sensor system can detect our signals. Now, again, this is a rather interesting argument in its own right if you're into the physics or engineering side of it, mostly revolving on the decreasing signal strength as you go outwards, the amount of technology that might be required to pick up our accidental broadcast, even at relatively modest interstellar distances. You know, we also have more higher energy deep space radars that could be detected further out, but again, it becomes a relative issue. How detectable is the signal? How big a receiver do you need to pick it up? There's also the time variability of it. You know, we're not broadcasting anything strong on a continuous basis. So then you also have to factor in the temporal nature of signaling, which also factors into us detecting others. So that even with our strongest signals, they're so intermittent on where they might be broadcasting to, what star systems they might sweep across, that even there you go, well, so someone has the right type of stuff to pick us up. Would they have actually done it? Or would they have gotten a repeat? You know, it might be that multiple ETIs have detected their equivalent of our wow signal, which has been non-repeatable and therefore can't be confirmed. On a more philosophical issue, the question is it wise to shout hello out into the universe? And it's a tough subject because we really only have Earth's history as our data point to go on. So it becomes quite speculative and often really boils down, I think, to people's philosophical outlook, or you could even call it biases, but everyone has it to some extent. You know, fundamentally, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Do you think human nature is good or bad? Those kind of things factor into this. Now, if you look at human history, as is frequently brought up in this debate, it's not a terribly good track record to look back on. First encounters between civilizations here on Earth have often not gone well for one side or the other, usually poorly for the less technologically advanced society. And I think we can all think of examples of that nature. Occasionally, less developed societies have managed to hold their own or hold out for quite a long time against technological dominance, colonization, whatever you want to call it, but it's generally not a good track record. And again, you come back to the issue of outlook. Do you think ET would be more like ET or more like alien or somewhere in between? As I know many of you know John Traphagen, and he is the co-author with me on the article behind this talk. And he has made quite an effort to point out over time that even if you do encounter ET, many people probably wrongly assume that it's going to be a monolithic society speaking with one voice. You know, would you expect that of us? No, and in fact, that's one of the major issues that might arise down the road. So even within another civilization, you may have aspects that are more like ET, and you may have aspects that are more like alien. I look at it more as a fundamental aspect of life and nature, and nothing that we see indicates anything other than it's a life form, eat life form universe out there. Again, at least as far as our planet goes. It's continually a survival of the fittest and a competition for resources. So I won't even attempt to resolve this issue, and I don't think it will be resolved until there's an actual contact. And even there, that still only would expand our data set to 2. But it's a fascinating debate and an endless source of good coffee discussions. When I look at it, and this is perhaps heavily filtered by my own military background, I look at it as a fail-safe issue. When you're talking substantial risk and potentially existential risk, it just makes sense to fail or err to the safe side. And in that regard, that's where I come down on, no, I don't think we're ready yet to be broadcasting or shouting hello into the wilderness here, just because our knowledge level is so minute on the issue. And there's a lot more to be figured out before we just go shouting hello to everyone that might be out there. And again, questions or comments at any point? I know these are pretty hot topics to some people. Okay, moving on. I did mention the law on the issues, and it's pretty weak. This is one area of law where I actually feel like I could carry my own. International law on space and exploration is actually brief enough to where any of us could actually memorize the whole set of law that exists. There's really only one treaty in force done back in the 60s, and with a heavy eye towards keeping the US and Russia from carrying their superpower competition into space. It's widely agreed to be very limited in scope and really not even remotely close to being up for where space is going nowadays, especially from the point of view of commercial space, mineral exploration and resources, that kind of area. So really widely inadequate. The key provisions that are in there right now revolve around space and celestial bodies being used and explored for the benefit of all. Did it still say mankind, or has that changed to humanity? I don't remember which. But used for that, so that essentially no one country can claim territory. But by the way, each country is responsible by this treaty for the behavior of its own citizens and companies. So down the road, there's going to be a point where, for instance, if Elon Musk is successful in launching a colony or establishing a colony on Mars, what does that mean? According to this treaty, no one can claim territory, and they would be subject to US governance. And another whole other interesting area of research or debate, really, because anyone's opinion is as valid as anyone else's in this area right now. Agreements on what do you do if a SETI signal is detected. There is a SETI protocol which has been adopted to, if you can call it that, by, oh, and I'm drawing a blank on the organization, the International, anyone can chime in if they remember the protocol originator. But the point being that this is a completely non-binding informal agreement with zero force of law. It has no force of law. It was offered to the UN, who essentially said, thank you very much, and filed it away and took no action. The protocol as it exists is basically, again, non-binding agreement among scientists to, if a signal is detected, to promptly disseminate it and mutually verify it to the extent possible, and according to the discoverer, essentially the first right of publication and public announcement. It's nice as far as it goes, but it is not even universally adopted even within the science community. So it's purely voluntary, and frankly, in my opinion, in a real world event, would be quickly overcome by political and governmental actions. Now I'm going to, wait, question coming in. Could a convincing SETI signal be forged by rogue individual, corporation, or state? Would powerful corporations have or states have an incentive to do this? Interesting question. Of course, I think that comes back to the false alarms we've gotten, which have been multiple times and have included coming from space. I personally think it would be very difficult to forge a signal that couldn't be very quickly determined to be fake, if nothing else because of being able to triangulate any signal that would be persistent enough to be verified. And how well can you craft something that doesn't have deeply inbuilt human biases in it? So personally, I don't think it would be done or could be done successfully. Would anyone have a motivation? I'm not sure that anyone at a large scale would. You know, would a nation state have a convincing reason to do so? Not a superpower, I don't think, because again, it just wouldn't hold water. Deep fakes, yes, you can deep fake what would be reported to be a signal, but again, deep faking, particularly the source of a signal, many of you, have much greater knowledge of this than I. I'm not a radio astronomer, but I just don't see a way to do that. And it would be expensive. Yes, you basically have to send something way out into space. And again, that's all traceable to broadcast a fake signal. It would be interesting. I'm just thinking on the fly here. Could you broadcast a signal and hide it, but make it powerful enough to bounce off a deep space body in the solar system so that it appeared to be coming from there? Again, I leave that to better expertise. A little bit on these are good questions. Keep them coming too. A little bit on realpolitik. What is that for those of you who may not have taken a course on international politics in a few decades? Realpolitik is a subpart of the realist school of international affairs. And you can largely boil down international perspectives of the conduct of nation states, essentially, into two main ends of the spectrum. You have the realist end and the idealist end. And I know there's more current terms than that, but even my experience in there is a little bit dated. But it's essentially the viewpoint that there is no higher governance than the state, and the only limitation on states' actions is power. It originates back in the 1800s with an overlooked but very interesting philosopher, Ludwig von Rothschild. But its earliest conception is widely traced back to ancient Greece, in particular Thucydides, which is one of my favorite works of all time, just because it's about the deepest perspective you can get on human affairs, politics, warfare. I mean, you get virtually a 2,500-year perspective across the whole of human written history, and realize when you read it that nothing about human nature, politics, or warfare has really changed other than technology in all that time. But in this, the war between Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece, there's what's called the Melian dialogue, where essentially it comes out that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. In other words, might makes right. And that is the fundamental aspect of the realist or realpolitik perspective. Further, Thucydides illustrates or states what he thinks the primary causes of war are. And he lists a few things, including honor / prestige and economics. But the dominant thing that he cites is fear. Fear of the other side, whoever that may be, gaining dominance over you. That is what he cites as the fundamental cause of war. And that, again, I think feeds back into the realist perspective and where I'm going to go next. And that is that, in my opinion, controlling communication with an ETI could be the single biggest prize ever in international competition. So think about that for a minute. You're talking about a fundamental pivot point in human history. And that could then become such a monumental prize that great power or superpower competition, whatever you want to call it, could go from 0 to 60 in a moment's notice. Now, why is that? Well, odds are, as we all know, any ETI that we were to make contact with would likely have a huge lead time on us in development. Now, there's all sorts of arguments over where, Does a billion years of cultural lead time give you a superior culture or not? No, that's open to debate. I know John would have quite a bit to say on that, John Tripagan. But on the technology side, most likely, yes. I mean, look at how fast our technological advancement is going and actually accelerating. Things like Moore's Law and such. So they're likely to have hundreds to billions of years of lead on us technologically. And, you know, even their toys, if we understood them, could revolutionize our science and technology. So you have the potential of a huge, maybe virtually unimaginable leap in technology. Remember Clark Tech, you know, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That prize of gaining sole access to vastly superior technology is what could spark a competition here. And by the way, let me back up and say, I am not in the realist school of political thought. I think it's a blend in between the realist and the idealist poles, but it is one of the dominant schools, and many countries and international leaders and elected officials do fully subscribe to that. And perception counts. So, you know, does it have to be an active dialogue to give us that benefit? No. You know, what if this signal that we detect is basically broadcasting the Encyclopedia Galactica? That's all you need. It doesn't have to be a two-way dialogue. Thus, even passively detecting a signal could be that spark, regardless of how deep its information content goes. Now, there's a lot of assumptions that are built into this argument. And let me go over those a little bit. Key to this, and perhaps the most fundamental assumption that even makes this argument possible, is that this communication or even the receiving of signals will require a large complex infrastructure. And this, I realize, is a debatable point, but it's an assumption to enable the rest of the argument. So the idea being basically, let's say it's a radio signal around the hydrogen line, then you need, presumably, if it's at a reasonable distance away, a fairly weak signal, you need a fairly large structure like a radio observatory to detect it. You also need fairly specialized people to take advantage of that, from the technicians to linguists to electrical engineers and such. And you also need, I think, to further assume that there's no fact checking available to ETI. In other words, no lurking monitoring systems within the solar system that could detect the equivalent of fake news. So that if one country were to monopolize the communications channel, in other words, and ETI had no way of verifying, you know, human agreement on this, what was being sent to them? So those, I think, are the three key enabling assumptions behind this argument. Another key one is you can quite reasonably argue that, well, could you really achieve technological dominance from monopolizing an ET communications channel? Or would you be able to hold on to a lead if you had it? I think those are perfectly reasonable arguments. But here is where I come back to perception counts, as in pretty much everything in politics, as we see all too well nowadays, but see historically too. Perception counts, and that's the key here. So if the leadership of one or more superpowers thinks that there is technological dominance to be achieved by monopolizing the communications channel, the discussion's over. They will act on that perception. Potential actions, I see some more questions coming in. I'll get back to them in just a second. Potential actions. Well, so, one or more superpowers have determined that they want to monopolize this communication channel. What avenues are available to them? And it's the whole range of action, from political through all out nuclear war, toe to toe with the Ruskies, to quote one of my favorite movies. It can range from, again, diplomatic actions. It can go into espionage type actions short of a war. It could include, assassinations. We have seen scientists and engineers being taken out of the picture by state actors for centuries, again, for the purpose of either preventing or preserving technological superiority. And again, it could go all the way up to full-blown warfare. Back to the large-scale facilities. Why does that matter? Well, because when you have a limited number of large-scale facilities, that just plays right into the sweet spot of military control. And by military control, I mean my bottom line there. That's preserving your capability while denying the enemy theirs. And this gets back into my deep professional training, where the ability to control industrial-sized facilities, whether they're power plants, refineries, whatever, even if they're up into the hundreds, is achievable by superpower level capability. And I'll come back to the note on physical security. Let me catch up on chat questions. Can we learn how humans will react to an ETI interlocutor, looking at how we react to God interlocutors? Well, that's a good question. I'd really throw that one out to discussion. That's so far outside my realm. Thinking on my feet, that opens up a whole set of interesting questions. Number one, I would expect the instant creation of many religions based around everyone's conceptions of what this ETI would be the second we picked it up. There's some existing religions it would be fascinating to watch how they react to this, to something like this when it occurs. Would they have any more authority than anyone else? I don't know. Right now, even if it's a government that's acting in that manner, overall, confidence in governments worldwide is at a relatively low point. So, an interesting discussion, perhaps one to throw out to the social science realms if anyone's on board. And if you are, please, chime in on audio. Another one is the paradigm here communications, or is it closer to archaeology, for lack of a better term? Yeah, that's another very interesting question. I don't think, if it were essentially an artifact communication, say, we don't have a way of knowing, first of all, more than likely. The point being that we'd pick up a communication. Would this apply to a techno signature? Maybe to a slight degree. I don't think it'd be as impactful a thing then. In fact, I would probably rule it out. So again, let's take the assumption that it's a signal of some sort, a deliberate signal. Well, unless it really says in there that this is, in memoriam of us, whatever ETI it is, then we're going to be working under the assumption that they're still around and still going. So it would be an ongoing communication. But again, even if it weren't, even if it's a one-way broadcast of something comparable to an Encyclopedia Galactica, that's more than enough to trigger this scenario. Would the perception by other nations that a given nation has the monopoly of ETI lead to greater stability because everyone's afraid of pissing off the alien, the alien interlocutor with its new technology power? Yeah. Similar, yes. And is it similar to a situation where one nation maintained monopoly on nukes early on? I think that's a very good analogy to draw. The answer to that, here's where we get back into why I was very carefully wording my perception of advantage. classical theory, international theory would tend to state that you would promote other countries ganging up on the one that has the lead if they're not just deathly afraid of them. So you could have a balancing effect. And again, you know, the difficulty of keeping other significant industrial capabilities from joining in is a tough thing to do. I think the scenario where the US had sole nuclear monopoly early on, but very briefly, is an interesting one. And again, it relies largely on the attitude of the country that has that monopoly. Would they be benevolent or not? You know, historically, if you look at governments on the earth, some would probably behave very badly with that monopoly. Some would probably behave very well. And another interesting twist on this from Srinivas, with billions and billions of wealth, would we have individuals acting such as nations in this? And that's a good point, considering that billionaire philanthropists are behind current SETI efforts to a significant degree. I think there's one main one. I don't know where the funding stands on that currently. But that's a case where, yeah, I could see them having the monopoly for about a day. But even billionaires, as we've seen recently, can't hold out against the power of a nation state. It's just not there, even with private militias or mercenaries. It isn't there. And going back to, if countries really are afraid or want to prevent country X from having that sole monopoly, don't forget there's now a slowly expanding club of nuclear powers. And that's still kind of the ultimate ace up the sleeve for someone who just doesn't want the other side to have that monopoly. All very interesting. A little note on physical security in this regard, and this might actually pertain to some of y'all. You know, one of my commands in the military was commanding one of those Predator drone wings in the war. And that's an interesting situation which the military took a long time to come to grips with. You are here in the US, but you're fighting and you know, using lethal effect on the other side of the world. What took a long time to realize was that those bases here in the US where we're doing that from are the front line. So we had imported the front line of the war right into, in my case, Houston, Texas. What's the security around that? How do you react to a terrorist attack that's directed at you under those circumstances? And that's an area where I think major astronomical facilities that are engaged in efforts along these lines probably need to do a little more thinking. I've got a deep background on how you coordinate, and again, you're not going to protect yourself against a nation state that really wants to shut down your facility. But there's a lot of threats below that level that can be much more adequately protected against. So if you're doing you know, optical SETI or other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, I think, frankly, a lot more thought needs to be put into planning in advance for this. The moment you've detected a signal and it's about to burst on the international news scene, you're way too late at that point. Now, okay. And Srinivas further elaborated, well, what about like the East India Company and their history until Queen Victoria stepped in? Yes, that's another interesting analogy. Again, I think that becomes a more interesting factor when you're talking about colonization of planets and then potentially having your own SETI efforts from that point. But again, there, you know, in the end, the nation state trumped, sorry, I didn't mean to use that word, trumped the power of even a very powerful semi-autonomous company, and were able to force them into submission. Very good points, though. I want to end on some uplifting points. At least I hope we're uplifting. Technology is advancing a lot, and perhaps one of the weaker assumptions in this scenario is that a large, complex infrastructure is required for SETI detection or for a METI conversation. That is obviously decreasing with time, although I don't know what the limits will be or are in terms of range versus size of your facility, the ability to listen versus the ability to broadcast, which can be very different things. There's also that international science community, and one of the perhaps best ways to short circuit this scenario or to terminate it before it really gets going is a method, and here's where I'd like to see the SETI protocols expanded maybe, is instant dissemination of any received signals, such that essentially you get the cat out of the bag before the bag can be closed or squished by a nation state. But it would have to be nearly instantaneous, including perhaps if there's machine learning analysis that's being done, can that automatically be distributed? And I know there's some limited aspects of that now, but I think it would need to be much more robust in order to make it abundantly clear to nation states that there would be no advantage to be gained in this regard. Although again, the caveat to the caveat is communicating outward, which again requires probably more infrastructure and capability. So I think that does it. I want to again acknowledge John Traphagen as my co-author on this, and I think many of you know him well. He's part of the group. I didn't see if he was on today or not, but if he is, he's welcome to join in and answer questions with me. Our paper was published recently in Space Policy. It goes into this in a little more detail and includes some sub components of this. So for instance, I think a lot of this argument could apply to detecting an alien artifact. If we were to actually have physical access to an artifact, the same thing applies. If it's not too big or too small, then that also is subject to the same types of attempts to control it from a nation state point of view as the signaling goes. So if it were an intact spacecraft, for instance, there would be quite a bit of competition for that, which also gets into why I don't think there's anything hidden in Roswell for considerations along those lines. So with that, how about some more questions to the extent we have time, and I'll stay on as long as anyone wants to.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Yes, people, please go ahead. I think we can be lenient. Unmute yourself and just ask away.
And I'll start off with one more from David Goldstein. So how do we interpret the fact that we haven't heard anything confirmed yet? Well, now you're getting into the whole Fermi paradox, which is a subset. I would urge you to sign up for my class in the fall, Life in the Universe. How's that for a plug? I'll be teaching one of the undergraduate studies freshman courses starting in actually a couple of weeks now on life in the universe, which includes the search and a heavy emphasis on the various aspects of the Fermi paradox.
I understand the Fermi, or I thought I did, obviously not at the way you're going to discuss it in class, but the question is back to perhaps your first or second slide about getting eaten.
Okay.
If you believe in Darwinian processes, how do you set that in context of maybe it's not wise to be heard?
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying there. And frankly, yes, I agree with you completely, because from my point of view, it's that life form, eat life form universe out there. So given that we're on the very beginning, we're a newborn infant on the technology scale, I'm a little hesitant to shout hello for that reason. I mean, I think there is an argument that can be made that as we get more advanced, our violent nature is reducing thanks to cultural evolution, because we're not physically evolving, and our hormones aren't evolving either. But our frontal lobes have the potential to be able to control those instincts. So yes, as I understand your question, well, one.
Well, my question
yes,
is, if everybody, if every time somebody becomes heard, they get eaten,
Yep.
that kind of squelches the conversation.
yeah, it does, in a very dramatic way. And yes, that's a perfectly germane argument to this. It is one of the main lines of thinking on the Fermi paradox on why we haven't heard from anybody, because frankly, most people are either hunkering down hoping not to be eaten, or they did speak up and got eaten. So it is a factor. And that goes back to, who has the right to voluntarily commit us to an existential risk? I really come down hard on that issue. If somehow as a world we can agree that we're willing to take a risk, or we've analyzed them and we think, the laws of physics kind of protect us in many ways, then okay. We got posted a link to the Fermi paradox, and is it dangerous to communicate? And yeah, there's a lot written on that. One of the textbooks I'm going to be using is an excellent one by, I don't have it in my office here. It's like 75 Solutions to the Fermi Paradox. It's second edition of a book by, I think it's Webb, but nice short answers to all the common ones.
Can
Another
you go
question?
back to the first slide, and especially the ant cartoon you had there?
Okay.
And that sort of emphasizes the major objection that I have to SETI, and especially to active SETI. And if you consider sort of the history of Earth and the history of life on Earth, humans have been around for just a minuscule fraction of that. And of that minuscule fraction, we have only really been a technological civilization for, well, you can argue as to how long it would be, but maybe 100 years. And that is just such a small fraction of cosmic time that in many ways, we are probably the newest technological civilization, if not in the solar neighborhood, perhaps in the entire galaxy. So anything else that's out there is either way behind us or way ahead of us. So how can we have any hope at all of recognizing any other technological civilization? I mean, all the other ones out there may already know all about us, are probably watching us. So, how can we fit into this whole picture?
I mean, I think to follow up too, it's also kind of worth noting that, in a galactic sense, we're kind of out in the boondocks, right? I mean, comparing, the, galactic center being, New York City, we're, out on, a small shack out in the middle of Montana or something. We're way out. And so, it could just be that when, if there's other life forms, they just go where, they would expect other life forms. They wouldn't go looking out in the, in the boondocks of the galaxy and seeing, oh, well, we don't see anything there because it's a large space. So, we're also just out in the middle of nowhere, I mean, for the large part.
Well, that brings up the whole area, subject of galactic habitable zones, which is interesting in itself. I don't really have a deep opinion on that, but it is interesting. I'm all for continuing to passively listen, because I think even though I put this scenario forward, I think we should be aware of it and do what we can to minimize the risk, but I still support listening. Now, could we even, to Bill's point, could we recognize if we found something? Who knows? I really like the work that's being done on detecting technosignatures. I think that's quite productive. And again, back to Bill's comment, I actually kind of would hope one of the best possible outcomes is that someone is actively watching us, which implies that they've decided not to eat us and we're home free. until we get to a certain maturity level. That would be a great scenario. So I'm all for discovering a lurker somewhere in the solar system, as long as it doesn't set off an alarm bell that then does bring in the hungry aliens from The Simpsons.
I wonder if you have any thoughts on resources, in the sense that, you know, if you look at I used to teach an undergraduate studies class on exploration of Earth, you know, focused on the oceans. And one of the interesting lines you can take through that kind of discussion is that there's always sort of been a critical resource over time in human history, whether it was spices or whether later it was oil, or, you know, something that was driving both exploration and conflict. Do we have any idea what's actually a valuable resource beyond our own technological level to have some concept of what's valuable, you know, why we would be eaten, let's say?
That's an excellent point. You know, personally, I don't see that there would be anything unique enough physically to be valuable. Unless it turns out that habitable planets are just unbelievably rare. I can't see that being a limiting factor. You know, if you can cross space, you can live in space. So, you know, I just don't see a lot of reason why someone would need to come in, other than we get back to that basic competitive aspect of nature and the fear factor, just, you know, an irrational fear that someone could dominate you or attack you or something, prompting the reaction in advance. It's the old nuclear war standoff, mutual assured destruction. It's no different, again, than why Athens and Sparta went to war. Sparta was getting afraid of Athens, even though they may or may not have needed to be. Anyone got some other thoughts on resources? The main thing I've seen anyone put forward that makes sense to me is those uniqueness things of humanity, creativeness, art, you know, but who's to say what's some other alien with different sensory perceptions is he going to think is art?
I mean, there are the theories in which people have, you know, done, well, maybe our solar system was hit by a supernova early on and that helped seed things. So maybe, you know, if that were true, then maybe the solar system would have some unique isotopes which could be used. But I mean, I think in general, we have a pretty typical sun and things like that.
Yeah. Craig, you were wanting to jump in there?
There are arguments that the practical way for us to explore out there and propagate around is to send out nano-robotic things of some kind. That is, we aren't going to send our own corporeal bodies. You turn the question around and say, well, then maybe that's what extraterrestrials are doing. They're flooding the galaxy with little robots or something. Any thoughts on that? I don't know how that changes the perspective that you put out here, which by the way, I very much enjoyed. That was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's fun for me too. It certainly isn't funded work. You know, that's an interesting point. I don't have, well, you know, that looks like that'll be our earliest efforts. You know, you have things like Breakthrough Starshot gearing up, which is frankly pretty exciting to me. I want to see it move ahead just as a way to get out there, but flip it around. So we lay our hands onto some of that coming in.
Now, we're not looking for micro robots right now, as far as I know. Anybody?
Not intentionally, but you know, we might find one on the Antarctic ice sheet too.
There you go.
But there again, you get back to that technology of even finding something like that from someone much more advanced than us would be revolutionary. And by the way, in my class, I also believe heavily in science fiction being a thought leader in these areas. One of the more interesting and left field takes on this whole idea I've seen recently was from David Brin, a novel a couple of years ago called Existence, which had a very, I think, unusual approach to this first contact and the international politics and the rivalry that could come of it. I recommend that. It's a little bit sporadic in its pace, but it really got me thinking. Let's see.
So all the assumptions that we are making like if we're going to be eaten or if we're going to be occupied, either way, come obviously from the idea that we're using our own values through time, right? Because that's all we know. Is there like any kind of, are people thinking about how other value systems might look like? For example, someone could just come and wipe us out because they feel, oh, look at these poor little creatures, they got nothing done. It would be much better for them to just be gone, right? That could just be a way of looking at us, right? From a different perspective. So is there any kinds of thoughts on interpreting or coming up with other value systems that might exist?
Yes, I think that is a very valid point. And again, even within Earth, I mean, we have some very xenophobic cultures. There are some primitive cultures that still kill outsiders on sight. We also have had very racist cultures quite recently in the world that looked on other cultures or other people as subhuman and not worthy of preserving too. I certainly hope that doesn't extend to people or to beings that get a lot more advanced, but again, we have a limited database. This is an interesting area, I think, for AI exploration. You know, we have the ability, I don't know how far developed it is because it's not my field, but blank slate AIs, you know, what is the possibility to essentially do laboratory experiments with what I call blank slate AIs with no boundary conditions, let them evolve a system of intelligence and see if it becomes the same life form eat life form kind of competition, or if there can be other outcomes. But that's the main way I see of us being able to maybe get outside our own boundary conditions of experience here on Earth. Let me quickly look at a couple more written questions that have come in before we go more verbals. Can you speak to limitations imposed by our one data point? Yes. How does that limit our ability? Well, what tools do we have? Okay, so I've kind of hit on that. Yes, it is a severe limitation, the fact that we really have one data point. You could maybe extend it, again, when you look back in human history at civilization to civilization context, although even there, we had some basic humanity in common. The caveat to that caveat is that understanding, even where we found some ancient writings, we have in common human nature, we still can't decipher them. So what gives us the ability to think that we're going to decipher something with no commonality in experience? And maybe, you know, what can we extend to other species on Earth? Dolphins probably have the closest, got the exact term, but that excess brain to body mass ratio of anything, of any other species. Studying human Neanderthal interaction, yeah, would be quite interesting. Unfortunately, there's not really a written record of that. So there's, you know, archaeology can say something, but it's mostly about how attractive each species found the other at different times, because we're all carrying a little bit of Neanderthal DNA. A couple of new messages. Yeah, it didn't go well for the Neanderthals. Well, depending on how you look at it, they do live on in us, apparently, at about the 2 to 4% level. History of Hawaii, yes, all the various, especially, I think the Pacific Island civilizations are a fascinating study in their own right, and probably one of the most germane ones to us going forward and becoming interstellar is how that worked here on Earth. And the last question that's come in so far seems like would be most likely to come across ETIs that have value systems that cause them to expand outward and visit many star systems. That might pre-select for more colonizing, resource-consuming cultures. Nice phrasing, I like that. Yes, as far as valuing expansion and exploration. Colonizing, yes. Resource consuming, I'm not convinced of that one. Again, there's a lot of resource out there. Do you need to dip deep into gravity wells to get it? I'm not convinced, but it's worth discussion. More up, another one coming in. This just in. But what if, What if that is just the values of a few rich technology? Yes, that gets back to, again, the whole, you know, you see it in science fiction, you see it commonly assumed that, well, ETI is going to be a monolithic society. Why do you think that? Is there any indication that we're going to be a monolithic society as we go out into space? I would say no. If anything, we're probably likely to diverge more as we go outward. And you know, a corollary that I like to point out to people also is, one, warfare is just an extension of politics by other means, according to Clausewitz. Does anyone think we won't take politics with us as we go out into space? Unfortunately, I think we will. And again, we've evolved culturally and knowledge-wise quite a bit, but biologically, we aren't evolving very fast at all. What was the title of the David Brin book? Existence. One word. Oh, yeah, there it is. Yeah, existence. Sean put that in there. Humanoid to humanoid relations is probably less potentially problematic than humanoid to other life form. Yes. Yes, we can always fall back on our physical commonalities. And the fact that we have brains that are wired the same way is a huge advantage to communicating between ourselves. But even that's not enough in many cases. It's a tough problem. You know, some of these questions are better for, I don't know if John Tripagan's on. I didn't see him come on earlier, but if you're on, John, please jump in. Some of these questions get a lot more into his bailiwick than mine. I'm really out on a limb on some of these. But on the other hand, there's so little actual data to go on that I can speculate pretty freely. That's one of the fun things about this area. I will put in a plug. John and I are trying to organize, when we have the bandwidth, a conference here at UT with the center's co-sponsorship on developing first contact scenarios. So what are the protocols, or developing protocols, I'm sorry, for various scenarios? What should be our guiding actions? You know, what essentially is a checklist that can be developed, not a straitjacket, but a guiding checklist on if we do ever have this first encounter, something that go way beyond the relatively limited perspective, I'd say, of the current SETI protocols, even the revision 2 that's out there. Yeah, David Brin, he is an astrophysicist at one of the California universities, I think, and a longtime science fiction author. He spoke at South by Southwest a couple of years ago. Very interesting, also very combative. He's probably the leading agitator against METI, and he can get pretty brutal in the scientific debates on that issue. More questions, comments. This is a lot of fun. I appreciate all the comments that we've gotten so far in discussion. We could do a follow-up on every one of these questions for an hour easily. And if anyone knows of any source that would actually fund further work in this area, please point me to them. Okay, more questions, comments. We're over our time limit, I think. Going once, going twice.
Well, thank you, Ken,
Back to y'all.
Thanks, Ken, for your fascinating talk. And I think we all really, truly enjoyed this. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks
Great,
very
I
much.
enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks.